our side event entitled Hidden Dangers in Plastic Waste, the Next Basel Challenge. My name is Jim Puckett. I'm the director of the Basel Action Network, a group of NGOs of the Break Free from Plastics movement that is going to be speaking to you about something that has been not talked about nearly enough. I would like to introduce the program that we are going to embark upon in this next hour. I'm going to introduce the problem real quickly and the issue, and remind everybody what was agreed at COP14 with the groundbreaking decision about changing the amendments with respect to plastic waste. And then we're going to have Dr. Sarah Broch of the IPIN talk about plastics additives, followed by Serene Rached speaking about thermosets and fluorinated compounds, unacceptable exemptions. And finally, we wrap up with Ms. Yuyun Ismawati talking about how this plays out on the ground in Indonesia. And then we'll follow it with questions and discussion. For asking questions, you can raise your hands if you want to do it orally, or you can write them into the chat throughout the whole presentation. We're not going to take questions until the very end, but we should have time to do that at the very end. For your information, this program will be recorded, and you can have a PDF of it as well. At the end, you'll see a pop-up window that you can download the PDF from. And as I understand, it will also be recorded, the audio as well. So without too much further ado, I think we can get going. So good morning, you all, and good night. It's 2 a.m. in the morning for me, so it's very good morning. 11 in Europe, and we have people all over the world, and a really good turnout here. So to remind ourselves of what was agreed last year, which will go into force next year on January 1, we had 3 new amendments to 3 different annexes. The first one was a new category in Annex 8, which is the hazardous waste list, for any plastic waste which possesses both an Annex I constituent and an Annex III characteristic at the same time. Then we had a new revised listing on Annex IX, the non-hazardous waste list, which took the old listings we had before, added a new twist to them, and created the non-hazardous waste list. Those are the wastes that are exempt from the controls of the convention. And then a new wrinkle was to add a new listing in Annex II, which was a little used annex of waste requiring special consideration. And that is going to be made up of any plastic waste not appearing on Annexes 8 or 9. So all plastics waste should live in one of these annexes. Now, the most important thing to realize that of those 3 different annexes, the one we're going to focus in on the most today is the one that's exempted, because those are the ones to which we've agreed for one reason or another, we're not going to control them under the convention. So we got to have good reason to not control them. And that Annex IX list actually now has 4 different categories of things that will be exempt from controls. The first category is plastic waste, which is almost exclusively consisting of one non-halogenated polymer. Can't have PVC, for example, but it can be polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, polystyrene, etc. And that is an open list. The second category is plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one cured resin or condensation product. And that also is an open list. In other words, it says, for example, it doesn't have a finite list. And the third category is plastic waste almost exclusively consisting of one of a short finite list of fluorinated polymer wastes. And those include PFAs and PFAS, that whole class of compounds. And then finally, the fourth category is an interesting one. It's the only mixture that's allowed, and that's a mixture of PE, PP, and PET, provided they're tested for separate recycling and are free from contamination and other types of waste. So those are the four categories we've agreed are benign and don't need to be worried about. We can trade them freely. Now, what we learned today with our speakers is that this is very problematic. Category 1 can still very well be hazardous. It's an open list, and moreover, it can contain, those polymers can contain very hazardous additives and additives that create problems with recycling. Category 2, the cured resins and condensation products, may in fact be hazardous in their own right, or they may also contain hazardous additives. Category 3, the fluorinated polymers, may in fact be hazardous in their own right, or they also might contain hazardous additives. And category 4, also, even though it's a mixture of things that we're very commonly living with, they too, PET, PP, and PE, may in fact have hazardous additives mixed into those polymers and therefore in that mixture. So I'm going to pass the baton now to Sarah, who's going to speak to you about the additives issue. So let me see if I can pass that baton. Yes, there you go. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jim. And as Jim just mentioned, I am going to talk about the plastic additives that we don't speak enough about. And I am presenting on behalf of IPEN, which is a global network of public interest, non-profit organizations in 125 countries around the world, working together for a toxic-free future for all on both a local, national, regional, and international scale. And before I get into the waste issue, we are in the context of the Basel Convention today, but I do want to emphasize and highlight that every stage of the life cycle of plastic is associated with toxic chemicals. So that's something to keep in mind while we're focusing on the waste today. And Jim went through the added parts of plastic waste that happened last year and coming into force next year. But I want to start with highlighting the Annex I waste stream that relates to hazardous plastic waste. So if you read the convention, you will see in its first article that if you have wastes that are contained in Annex I, unless they possess any Annex III characteristics, if they do not possess that, of course. So if they are categorized as hazardous and are in Annex I, then it's a hazardous waste. And you find the plastic waste actually in Y13 in Annex I, where you have waste from production, formulation, and use of resins, latex, plasticizers, glues, and adhesives. So what does that actually mean? Well, these are the plastic resins. So there you have all your plastics, and I see some of them turned around when uploading it to this platform, but I'm sure you'll recognize them anyway. You will have your PVCs and your polypropylene and so on and so forth. And what is also important to know is that when you think about plastics, you have to think about the whole plastic material. You have both the plastic polymer, but mixed in that plastic polymer, you have a range of additives to provide the function you want to achieve with that specific plastic. So you will have plasticizers to provide flexibility, for example. You have flame retardants in electronics and other plastics. You have pigments and so on and so forth. I listed a few examples of additives here, but there are many, many more. And there are a few things I do want to highlight with those examples I put down. Just looking at the examples, you see the chlorinated paraffins, you see brominated flame retardants, BPA, lead, arsenic, and so on. And some of them you recognize from the Stockholm Convention listings. Some of them I'm sure you recognize from national and regional regulations. And also, if you're into toxic chemicals, some of them you recognize because they are well-known toxic chemicals that are actually added into plastics for some reason. So that's important when we talk about the hazardous characteristics in Annex III of the Basel Convention. The other thing I want to highlight is the amount of these chemicals that are added. And if you look at the right column of this table, you see that you actually have quite a significant amount in the plastic. Even though it varies depending on the chemical, you do have quite a lot of it in most cases. And that relates to the requirements of the recent listing where it says that the plastic that is in Annex IX, so the plastic that is not controlled, should be almost free from contamination. And looking at the chemicals in these plastics, I think it's arguable if they are free from contamination. So you have two issues here. You have the hazardous characteristics and you have the contamination issue. And just to look further into this point, there was a study done in the EU last year, maybe 2 years ago, looking at plastic additives commonly used. The people conducting the study reached out to importers or producers and verified 418 additives as used. And they looked at these additives and looked at what regulatory controls were already put in place or in the process of being put in place in the EU. And you see quite a significant amount, especially if you look at the flame retardants or the heat stabilizers, the antioxidants. You're way past 60% that are under regulatory scrutiny for their hazard. So the Annex III hazard characteristics of the Basel Convention is something that we really need to look more at. And these are, again, just a few examples. I can't fit everything in one slide, but looking at the H6, where you have the acute poisonous substances, you could easily fit lead in there, especially thinking about all the lead that is put into PVC and think about the waste of PVC and that's being handled. You have your endocrine disrupting chemicals and your carcinogens, if you look at delayed toxicity, for example. And there it's really important to remember that these are chemicals that act at really, really, really low concentrations. They're called non-threshold chemicals in the cases. And you have ecotoxic substances like triclosan. But also, if you look at H13 in Annex III, this is really interesting because that deals with substances or materials that can turn into other toxic substances. So one obvious example here is the brominated flame retardants that will yield brominated dioxins when heated. So brominated dioxins are one of the most toxic substances there are. And that also relates to the exemptions that Jim mentioned, and Serene will talk more about. So I will not go into that, but H13 is really important to keep track of as well. And just to show an example here about the toxic recycling that can occur due to these toxic additives. So if you have, for example, plastics that has brominated flame retardants in them, and then you recycle them, which means that you heat these plastics and yield brominated dioxins, which means that in your recycled material, you will have some of the brominated flame retardants as they were, and different versions of those, but also these breakdown products like brominated dioxins. And when you do this, you can see that you will end up as these reports I put here, all available on IPEN's website. You will have widespread contamination, for example, in children's products and food contact material, and we do not want that. I also want to relate back to another amendment that just came into force, and that's the Basel Ban Amendment, and that deals with hazardous waste. So typically, the Annex II waste are not covered here. The plastic waste is not covered here, but the hazardous waste is. So considering all the hazardous additives in plastics and the consideration of some plastics to be hazardous waste, this ban amendment is something that would also help prevent export and import of those in an unsound way. So I just want to highlight the importance for all countries to ratify that amendment as well in relation to plastics, even though it's not currently covering all plastics. So just to conclude, most, maybe all types of plastic waste contain hazardous chemicals of various sorts, which make them contaminated to a certain extent, but also they cannot be recycled in an environmentally sound manner because those hazardous chemicals will just carry over to the next material or the recycled material. And especially concerning is these additives that are endocrine disrupting and carcinogens that have effects at very low levels. And just the take-home message here is that the plastic waste that is in Annex IX right now, that should definitely be reconsidered, keeping this in mind. And just to come back to what I started with, the whole life cycle of plastic, the solution when it comes to toxic additives and when it comes to plastic waste in general is you have to stop producing plastics, because that's the first step. And when it comes to the toxic or hazardous additives, there is no good way of dealing with them in the end, actually, with the waste or in recycling. So you also need to remove these. So that is the only solution, is to stop the production of fossil-based plastic. And in the very few cases where you can actually deem them as essential, these plastics should be produced, used, and recycled in a way that is safe for human health and the environment. Thank you very much. That's all for me, and I will try to leave the baton to Serene. Serene, you should be able to go forward with the presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. My name is Serene Rashid, and I work with Gaia, a worldwide alliance of more than 800 groups in over 90 countries working for a just, toxic-free, and waste-free world. We were set up nearly 20 years ago now. Gaia works to phase out waste disposal, including incineration, and promote zero-waste systems, as well that bring justice for workers and communities alike. My presentation is called Unacceptable Exemptions, Cured Resins, and Fluorinated Compounds. As Sarah mentioned, we're looking at these exemptions that currently sit on Annex IX of the Basel Convention. And as Jim mentioned earlier, those Annex IX exemptions mean that there are no restrictions on the trade of these plastics. So I'm going to explain today why we believe that this is a grave threat to our environment and to human health. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about this Annex IX. So as mentioned earlier, and it's useful to recall, the Annex IX wastes are considered to be neither hazardous nor requiring special consideration. Although in theory, this hazardousness test, so looking if wastes have Annex I constituents and Annex III characteristics, can still be applied on a case-by-case basis. So that would mean, for example, on a shipment-by-shipment basis. But really, in practice, there's no guarantee that this test will be applied if those wastes are listed on Annex IX. So by listing wastes on Annex IX, we are taking great risks, and we are implying that we have great confidence that there are no threats to human health and the environment. So Annex IX defines what falls outside the scope of the convention. We should be really careful with what's on it. And according to the precautionary principle, when a risk is unknown, we should assume that it is significant, and we should plan corresponding protective measures. And so there is a structural problem right now with the Annex IX listing on cured resins and condensation products, because that listing is open-ended. It means that there is no way we can establish the absence of risk. There is no way that we can ever gather exhaustive evidence that proves and guarantees the safety of those condensated products and cured resins. But what do these mean anyway? What are these products? So this current reference to cured resins and condensation products is rather obscure. And to be honest, some of us as well initially didn't realize what it really meant. As Jim mentioned, the listing is, clearly mentions few examples that are only examples, and so it's not an exhaustive listing. But actually, what these mean is thermoset plastics. So plastics in general are divided between thermoplastics and thermosets. What's the difference? It's a chemical difference. Thermosets go through a chemical curing process. During this process, there's a chemical modification. That means they cannot be melted. They don't melt when they're heated. They cannot be reformed to make new products. They cannot be mechanically recycled. Now, these thermosets are very diverse. They include a few materials that are on the slide, so some textiles and paints, for example, acrylics, you'll be familiar with those. Polyamide textiles, these were really popular in the 90s, but still popular. Polyesters that you'll know, and there are also some polyesters that are thermoplastic. Polycarbonate, so your lenses from sunglasses or reading glasses or vision glasses. Also polyurethane you will have come across in some circumstances of your life. Also some insulation foam, urea, formaldehyde, fillers as well, laminates and fiberglass. So laminates, obviously, that means that you're looking at composite products with several kinds of materials. Melamine, which is very popular for kitchenware, and epoxies, which you'll be familiar from your DIY work at home. It's a two-stage glue that's very, very widespread and currently used, as well as other plastics. These thermosets, and one strange thing to note, they can be halogenated. And so the current way that they're listed in Annex IX directly contradicts the decisions that we made last May, where we recognized that we should exclude halogenated polymers. So right now, we have a rule for plastic polymers that excludes halogens, and then right afterwards we contradict it with a listing on thermosets, which doesn't include halogens, and as well with a listing on the fluorinated polymers. And I would like you to remember this open-ended listing issue as well. So what are the fluorinated plastics that are currently on Annex IX? Fluorinated plastics have a fluorine atom in their molecular structure, which typically gives them above average resistance to heat. Fluorine is one of the halogens, which is why this listing is also problematic. So the 5 fluorinated polymers that are currently in Annex IX are usually used in specialty tubing and film, membranes and coatings for their heat resistant and non-stick properties. It's worth highlighting that in addition to these 5, some representatives of the fluorine industry are asking for 2 more to be added, one of which you'll be very familiar with, PTFE. The commercial name is Teflon, so it is widely used for non-stick cookingware and other non-stick coatings, as well as ETFE, which is used in specialty film. So what are the dangers for health and the environment? Why are we trying to expose the dangers that are related to these exemptions that are on Annex IX? So first of all, Sarah already mentioned, there's this definition of hazardous waste in the Basel Convention, where we can match Annex I constituents, that's the blue circle on the left, and Annex III characteristics, that's the purple circle on the right. And so in terms of the constituents on the left, they're listed there, as you can see. All plastics not only have constituents, but are mainly made from the Y13 constituents. So, plasticizers, latexes, resins, glues, but they also fall into several other ones. So the paints and varnishes, as we said, several plastics used as laminates for coatings. Some of them are phenol compounds like phenol formaldehyde. Those that have halogens, including fluorine, including bromine, are organohalogens. And that applies obviously to the fluorinated polymers as well. Now, since all of these plastics have Annex I constituents, then we only need to show that they have some Annex III characteristics to show that they are hazardous. So what might these characteristics be? Some of them are carcinogenicity, so triggering cancer, and these include, and it's a non-exhaustive list, some of the cured resins, so thermoset urea formaldehyde and phenol formaldehyde, several epoxies. But also, we should remember that the hazardous characteristics, they don't only come from the polymer itself, they can come from additives that Sarah mentioned, the intentional additives. They can also come from unintentional additives, which are residual chemicals from the parent compound, from the production process. And when we look at those residual compounds that can reach levels of 4%, between 100 ppm and 4% of the mass of a product, depending on the production process, indeed we find many chemicals with hazardous characteristics. BPA, that's the monomer on which polycarbonate is made from, but also vinyl fluoride for PVF and PVDF, also formaldehyde in several cured resins, etc. And here it's worth recognizing that some jurisdictions have clearly recognized that residual parent compounds, that non-intentional additives can trigger hazardousness. The European Parliament and European Council have identified specific thresholds for carcinogens in products that are as low as 0.1% and even 0.3% for reproductive toxicants. Anyhow, so I hope that here I've conveyed to you the sense that indeed, if we apply the definition in the Basel Convention for hazardousness, these Annex IX listings should not be there at all. So then there's another question to ask to understand if these thermosets and fluorinated plastics belong on Annex IX at all. As you remember, when we passed the amendment at the last COP, we had a requirement for all the plastics that are exempt from control to be destined for environmentally sound recycling. So then that means logically that all the plastics listed below should be recyclable. Otherwise, it's a contradiction again. So are thermosets recyclable? As mentioned, during the curing process, they become resistant to heat and you can no longer melt them to remold them. So they're not mechanically recyclable inherently. In addition to that, they're often used in composite materials as paints or adhesives, laminates, binders. So that makes them hard to recycle for recycling, even if we didn't have the first issue. So these thermoset plastics, since they're not recyclable, that makes the risk that they will be mismanaged, dumped in the open environment, or burnt even higher than average. And that triggers hazardous emissions. What happens when we look at fluorinated polymers? Well, we have similar issues. Since fluorine confers heat resistance, fluorine gives heat resistance to these plastics, so it's harder to recycle. And specifically for PTFE, which is not currently listed, but which some industry representatives would like to see listed, it's well known that its properties make it hard to recycle because it becomes very viscous. Fluorinated polymers in particular raise serious concerns when they are heated and when they are burnt because of the toxic emissions that they produce. So there again, we believe that there's a high potential that they'll be mismanaged, and so that exempting them from waste trade controls is not justified. So here you can see a little bit more detail. I won't go in the full detail, but of course, when you download the presentation, you can see, and you can always contact us for more. But there are many hazardous gases and emissions when fluorinated polymers are degraded. There are fluorinated plastics can generate dioxins and furans when they're burnt. They're not as famous as the brominated and chlorinated dioxins, but they do exist. There's also a very corrosive gas called hydrogen fluoride, which is typically produced, but also gases that deplete the ozone layer and contribute to climate change, as well as particulate matter and other kinds of toxic emissions. So all in all, clearly the fluorinated plastics that are listed under Annex IX currently and which industry would like to add all meet the H13 hazardous characteristic, meaning they trigger further dangers when they are disposed, burnt, or dumped. Similarly, here we've identified issues when thermoplastics are burnt or dumped. So these toxic emissions here are specifically those that occur during thermal degradation. So that includes open burning, but that also includes incineration in controlled conditions, as well as pyrolysis and gasification. So any thermal treatment will trigger these emissions. And as you see, there's plenty here to establish risk of hazardousness. And it's worth noting that some of these emissions also are relevant for other conventions, such as the Montreal Protocol, since polyurethanes, depending on the manufacturer and process, may have some chemicals in them that are ozone-depleting agents and that get released when these polyurethanes are burnt. So in conclusion, should we shift these thermosets and fluorinated waste to Annexes 1 or even 8, since we've shown that they're hazardous? No. And even before we answer that question, how did these thermosets and fluorinated plastics get on Annex 9 in the first place? Well, that happened during a meeting in February 1998 in Malaysia when this Annex 9 was first drawn up as a suggestion from some of our industry colleagues. And it is actually quite worrying that there was no thorough examination of environmental risks since then. Anyhow, we're now in the 21st century. I think we can afford to improve on what we did in the 1990s. There is a climate emergency and broader ecological and human health crisis. So we really need to revisit these Annex 9 exemptions to protect health and the environment. And we absolutely believe that these thermosets and fluorinated plastics waste should be off Annex 9. The question that I leave you with is which country will show leadership to do that at COP15? Thank you very much. And I'll pass the baton to Yuyun.
Okay, thank you so much, Serene. Okay. How can I share it?
You do not need to share it. You just have to use the arrow.
Yeah.
On the left
Okay.
side.
Yeah. Okay. I got it. Please apologize first that intermittently I will change my headset with the speaker. So I will do some movement, but because my connection, the audio is on and off. Okay. I would like to continue the sharing the information and experience on the ground, as has been explained before by Serene and Sarah about the background information of the toxic additives and information inside plastics. Okay. I would like to share the toxic chemicals that we found in plastic waste in Indonesia. This is the case study that done collectively with IPEN, Ecoton, and Arnica last year. Formerly known as Bali Focus. We established in 2000. And we work at the local level to address the global challenges, and we work with stakeholders, especially to protect vulnerable groups from the impact of development to their health and environment, and we work towards a toxic-free world and sustainable future. And our organization is also part of Break Free from Plastics and Gaia, as well as Basel Network. So this is what you see on the ground. if plastics and paper move from one country to another country, this is how it looks like. So in the container, there are a mix of everything. So I don't know how importers and customs will be able to differentiate the type of resins, the types of chemicals, if they come in a bulk like this, mix of everything. And in Indonesia, plastic waste enter to our country through paper scrap importations as well as paper scrap. So some paper companies also receive mixed paper, almost 40% of it containing plastics, flexible plastic packaging, and so on. So this is the mess that we received, as well as in other countries, I guess. The plastic scrap trade in Indonesia has been increased significantly, especially in 2018 when China closed the door. And in 2019, we still also see some high influx, but some reports are not recorded yet. So the report from Indonesia is in purple, and the report from exporting countries are in pink or magenta. You can see some discrepancies here. There are some factors affecting discrepancies, but we receive Indonesia imported most of the plastic scrap from Germany, Netherlands, the US, and Marshall Islands. That will be interesting to look at what's going on in Marshall Islands. But this is also representing the traders who do the exchange. And then this okay, so this type of packagings are the one that commonly found in plastic scrap imported by companies in Indonesia. And these are mostly discarded or dumped by the importers because they don't need them all. They need only specific type of plastics, for instance, PET. But to import PET, last year, companies still have mixed plastics like this, including food packaging, like on the right side, that have multi-layers. I don't know how we are going to categorize this multi-layers packaging if some of the layers containing certain chemicals. Should we just put it one as in Annex 8, or should we consider this safe or containing non-hazardous? But who knows? It will need a thorough check and examination. And these kind of plastics also dumped by paper scrap imported by paper companies in East Java. This is the example from East Java that mostly containing single layer packaging and then multi-layers laminated packaging, LDPE, PET, and HDPE. Why these things ended up in plastic waste? The entry point for this, the commodity with 90 at the end. So for paper, it's HS code 470790, that they might contain all this unwanted stuff. For plastic waste, it's the HS code 391590. So they will have everything, all the mixtures of unwanted plastics. So the Indonesian companies imported about 3.5 million paper scrap every year from various countries. Mostly the exporting countries are the US, Italy, the UK, Japan, Australia, and Singapore. And because we found lots of mixture and unwanted plastics from paper companies being dumped to the communities, we learned that all these unwanted plastics are utilized by the communities for other purposes because it was not imported for recycled or intended for recycling, but not 100% recycled. 40 imported paper and imported plastics are unmanaged. It means ended up in an open space, being burned, or utilize it for tofu productions like this one in East Java. We collected the samples of ashes and eggs, chicken eggs, who were hanging around near the dump site. And we collected eggs from several places. And we analyzed it in the lab in the Netherlands, Germany, and Czech Republic. Because in Indonesia, we don't have laboratory that can analyze certain chemicals, especially POPs chemicals and sophisticated chemicals that mentioned by Sarah and Sirin before. So this is going to be the next problem of importing countries. When they imported plastics, either under Annex 3, Annex 8, or Annex 9, there will be still problem in the destination countries. How can they prove that all of these plastics waste imported by those countries are not containing those harmful chemicals? This is only an example on the ground, but I guess it will be more complex if we take a look at different type of plastics and its utilization on the ground. From these samples from 2 sites in Tropodo and Bangun, in Tropodo, the communities use plastic scrap to burn it as fuel to make tofu. So all the fumes and the smokes that you see in the picture came from the furnace of tofu makers. So in one village, there are about 28 until 30 tofu makers, and all of them use plastic scrap from paper companies. We collected some samples from Tropodo as well as from Bangun. From Bangun, the pictures on the ground and then with the chicken walking around, those are they are foraging the food from that burning open space, open burning areas. The results, you can see it on the right. This is, you can find it on in the report. My colleague Jindrik is typing the link to the publication. You can click and find the report there. The dioxins contained in the eggs from Bangun and Tropodo are quite high. In fact, the samples from picogram per gram fat, which is the second highest in Asia. The first highest in Asia was from Vietnam Agent Orange site. So you can see the scary comparison between Agent Orange impact and the plastic waste import and paper waste import. It's uncomparable sector, but it's the same scary results. And it's not only dioxins in the eggs that we found. The results from the laboratory also shows polybrominated dioxins, and then HCB, PECB, HCBD, all the chemicals that are difficult to spell, but some of them already mentioned by Sarah and Serene. So you can see also at the bottom the PFAS concentration also found mainly in the Bangun, in the open burning site. And it should not be there. It's in the chicken eggs that consumed by children and the communities every day. And currently there is no standard that shows the safe level of that harmful chemicals in the food chain. So I just want to say that the importation of mixed plastics and mixed waste should be prohibited, and it should be ended, especially in developing countries without adequate and sufficient laboratory to analyze. it's difficult to follow the guidance, because from the exporting countries also it will need meticulous waste separations from source. It means consumers and waste collections from households and in the area have to change, because how can we differentiate these containers and that containers containing what? So that's just to bring you all to the reality. I will pass this button to Jim again. Let me try it a bit.
Thank you, Yuyun.
Yeah, where
I think we're good.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we've made the case here, just beginning to make a strong case, but I think it's very convincing, the case we've made, that things that are on Annex IX currently and are currently being traded and will be traded next year freely are in fact hazardous waste, or at the very least waste requiring special consideration. And it happens every day, unfortunately. And in fact, when you traffic in a waste and you do not properly characterize it as being hazardous, in other words, you have not done the analysis and documentation that accompanies that shipment, it is by definition illegal traffic under the convention. So we're dealing with a very serious legal matter that reflects a very serious human health and environmental matter, because this is happening every day, and we can expect to have it happen in the future until we deal with this problem of the hidden additives, the unacceptable exemptions, that things are hazardous in their own right. So we'd like to open it up now for questions if you have them, and to find them, or to raise your hand. And anybody raising their hand we can call on and hear your question. So the floor is open. Any questions? You raise your hand by finding your name on the list, and there should be a little hand that you can click on, and then I can see it. I don't see anybody raising their hand, so I'm hoping it's working. There we go. There's someone, Jonil Morgan. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jonil Morgan from Jamaica. I just have one question from the presentation from Shalene Rashid. Right? You said this Annex 9 amendment was formulated all the way back in the 1990s, right? Do you know if there are any plans now for the actual review of these Annex 9 before implementation in January 2021, seeing that they were just adopted and no further review of these annexes?
Thank you. So this issue of these two listings that we highlighted is an issue that COP14 agreed to further examine. So there was a call for information for last June. Some groups made some submissions. And so we really believe that they should be addressed at COP15. However, also with the disruptions we've had this year, the fact that we can't meet face-to-face, etc., there has still not been much movement on this. So we have some information that we've submitted, but there's no clear space for discussion of this. And we really, that's why we really hope that you know, through the side event, we can help contribute to this debate and to move things forward towards some action. It's not being addressed either in the annexes review process, which is a very important process, but that has its own timeline and its own priorities that were set before this came up. Hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Got a question here from Nozuko Guai. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks, Jim. It's Suki Guai from South Africa. Thank you for the good presentation. I was kicked out and I had to come in again in connection challenges. Jonil asked the question and Serene responded, but what I wanted to also add on is the issue of, in most cases, you would find that at times there should be a trigger by the affected party in cases like this. I mean, we know for a fact that countries that are impoverished, there's a challenge of bribery at the highest level to accept these hazardous waste at times other than the illegal dumping. And then individual gets benefits, and yet the rest of the population suffers. In us, what is the possibility in us when we're reviewing these annexes, such that we put systems, practical systems in place, such that the onus is not only on the affected party to be able to pull that trigger when there's evidence and everybody can see there's evidence, because power play comes in all of these matters. If it's a bigger brother kind of, so to speak, country, and they would do that to the poorer countries. And then the poorer countries, because they are depending on this bigger brother country, maybe for security purposes and things like that, then it's not easy for them to pull the trigger to say this country dumped or is illegally dumping or forcing us to take their hazardous waste, when we know for a fact that we can't, we don't have any ways of managing it in an environmentally sound manner, and it's definitely going to be adversely affecting our people, but we can't say no to it. So it's not just a matter of reviewing these annexes. We need to come up with practical systems and be cognizant of the power plays that are out there when it comes to these environmental issues, such that if any other person is able to produce credible evidence that indeed this country was forced, or this country found itself forced, is not the right term, because then the question is, how do you prove that this country was forced? That hazardous waste landed in a country that is not in a position to manage it in an environmentally sound way, the way and the manner in which we all know. So I think that needs to come forth in whatever that we're doing to protect this. And we all know that the shift now is there. The country that was taking most of these hazardous waste for fuel purposes is no longer taking. So a region like ours in Africa could be targets. And we know the issues of bribery also, they are there. Porous borders, those things are there. Not having equipment at the borders to check exactly and to verify if whatever that is supposedly coming for recycling or for whatever, it's actually what it has been declared to be. So those are the practical challenges most developing countries are faced with. Thank you.
Yes, precisely what you're talking about is why we created the Ban Amendment and why the Bamako Convention exists. Parties knew that prior informed consent and notification could be corrupted, and is often corrupted when large amounts of money are involved. And so at the time when the amendment was adopted, the developing countries, and particularly in Africa, said, we don't want a notification scheme, we want a prohibition. We don't want anybody to be tempted to sign a consent form. And it's still is absolutely apt today. This is still a major issue, and we're very happy to say that the Ban Amendment is now in force. We want more parties, as Sarah said, to ratify it, to be part of it, and indeed the Bamako Convention is starting to look at the whole issue of imports of plastics and make sure that they are part of the annexes of what's banned from coming into Africa. So we have a lot of tools to make things absolutely illegal from the exporting state side. If there is illegal traffic, then we have to go to a whole new set of potential mechanisms. The compliance committee can come into play, enforcement at the national level, et cetera, cooperation with other parties, et cetera. So I hear you, and these are real issues that do take place on the ground. You're very much concerned once something is subject to prior informed consent that there could be a lot of corruption involved. Just final note I want to say that what I mentioned about and what Sarah mentioned about this material really being a hazardous waste, even though it's on Annex IX, that in fact, if the chemicals actually do present a constituent of Annex I and a hazardous characteristic of Annex III, then they are subject to the ban amendment. And we would posit that many of these plastics are just that, because of the additives and because of their own toxicity inherent in the compounds. So, do we have any more questions? I hope I helped with that explanation. I'm looking for more hands or more questions. Recently, plans of plastic waste dumping from USA to Kenya was in the news, and it was mentioned that big oil companies are lobbying to transport waste to poorer nations. Just transition to a sustainable future cannot take place in this manner. Yeah, the New York Times article, if you have not read it, is very interesting. It was derived from some documents that were received from Freedom of Information Act in the USA. And indeed, they show that the large plastics and fossil fuel industry is looking to enjoin free trade agreements with African nations wherein they can export not only wastes, but problematic product plastics to Africa. And it will be put into a free trade agreement, which may, trump some of the environmental agreements if they're not handled properly. So this is something to be very cognizant of. These free trade agreements that are being signed bilaterally between the United States and other countries need to be really scrutinized for this type of hidden landmine. We've got a question from Roland. Roland, go ahead and take the mic, unmute yourself.
Yes. Thanks, Jim, and to all presenters for this interesting webinar. I have two comments. One is on the combustion of the fluorinated polymers. Actually, what is not formed are fluorinated dioxins. Yeah. So I mean that was a topic of my PhD. And if the presenter want to contact me later on, I can give him information on that. So combusting fluorinated chemicals and pyrolysis of this fluorinated polymers for sure release hazardous chemicals, different kind of, but not fluorinated dioxins. And one interesting thing, when I looked to this egg study in Indonesia, I saw that the levels are very, very different. And one of the eggs had a very, very high contamination. I think it would be really interesting to look to the pattern of the eggs and also of the soils. Yeah, because in addition to plastic, maybe also PCBs also have been combusted in these areas from these boilers.
Thank you. Maybe just a response on the fluorinated dioxins. Thank you very much for your contribution, and of course be interested to discuss. Our data comes from the Norwegian Institute for Air Research, who did a study in 2000, I believe it was 2011, it may be 2009, that was reviewing emissions from incinerators, municipal waste incinerators, that were incinerating some fluorinated wastes. And so they measured and included in there, it was a review of existing scientific literature, and they raised this issue of the fluorinated dioxins, although they don't usually receive as much attention as the brominated and chlorinated ones, because I understand that their half-life is not as long. And we followed up with the researchers who did the research at the time, because we were also interested, because these fluorinated dioxins don't get as much attention as the other ones. So indeed interesting to discuss together and maybe understand if you have any information on the specific reasons why there might be some different findings between the studies that you did and the research on what was coming out of incinerators that are burning these wastes.
Yes, no. So I know where it comes from, and I have been involved in all of this. So when Japan did the first assessment of the destruction of the CFCs, fluorinated chlorinated hydrocarbons, I gave them some standards from me, because I was the only one who let's say also synthesized these fluorinated dioxin standards, and then they analyzed. And finally, there is one abstract where they said that they found some fluorinated dioxins. But when I looked afterwards to the chromatograms, I told them that what they have measured was my standard. So 3 years later, when they did the second paper, in this paper, then they said, okay, and acknowledged that the results from the first paper was not correct, that it was rather a laboratory blank. Yeah, so I can send you that materials and all of this, and also the explanation why it's not an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we're getting a little bit detailed, but what you're providing us is great information. Let's do it offline. Certainly, we want to correct our reporting if it's needing to be corrected. So thank you. I have another question. I'm moving things along because we're running out of time. A question written in the chat regarding, are there any attempts in importing countries such as Indonesia to transform this wealth of evidence into a political agenda, pressure at the national level? I think this will help us achieve what we want under Article 9. I'm not sure what article, I guess that's illegal traffic. Go ahead, Yuyun. Can you answer how this can be campaigned on in a country like Indonesia?
Yes, thank you, Yahya. As the result of our advocacy since 2018, by the end of 2019, the Indonesian government issued a new regulation and changed the title of the regulations, importation of non-hazardous waste for industrial purposes. Before that, it was only the importation of non-hazardous waste, and that's contradict with our law, because in our law it said that nobody allowed to import waste into the Indonesian soil. But then the government changed their mind, so they issued the new regulations. They issued the new regulation only allowing companies to import scrap through several ports, not all ports. And also they have some restricted requirements now for importers. They have to show that they have trade agreement with the traders. So it's not only just sending stuff and so on. Unfortunately, there is no peer informed consent yet. But the mixture of waste, 90 at the end of the digits, are still to be imported. But the Indonesian government are now developing a roadmap for plastic waste importation in Indonesia. So we are hoping that by January there will be something new. We haven't received yet any draft of the roadmap, but there are a couple of action plans already developed in Indonesia to address the plastic waste and marine litter.
Okay, we have another question here from Lisa Amado. In accordance with the above, do you consider that the plastics amendment is a setback? Absolutely not. It was extremely important and extremely dramatic development, what we achieved at COP14. However, I think all of us are realizing as we dig into the plastics waste issue that it's so much more, it's so much worse than we thought. Plastics have, for us, too long been ignored as a hazardous problem, as a toxicity issue. We deal with them in our everyday lives, but we don't really think about what it means at the end of their life when you have to deal with that hazardous material, and even during their lives when the material leaches out into our lives. So when you start digging into the plastics issue, you find out some real horrors, and I think it's going to take a stepwise approach. And the amendments we adopted at COP14 was the first step, and now we really need to dig deeper into what it is we're exempting and really see if that is correct legally and from an environmental standpoint. I see that, Jindrik, did you want to take the floor?
Yeah, I just wanted to react what Roland raised, that
well, let's not go there because we've
yeah,
sidelined that issue.
Yeah, therefore I put
okay.
my hand down.
Anybody else has a question, be sure to raise your hand so I can see it. The chat is quite full.
My hand is raised, Jim.
Okay, who am I seeing here?
Nolo Zugo from South Africa.
Okay, again?
Yes, would you allow me? Thanks.
Yes.
I know we're out of time. A quick one. Jim, we've got all these instruments and tools internationally and even regionally. I don't know how familiar you are with the situation in our African continent. Like I said, issues of bribery and so forth, the tools are there, for example. Enforcement is a serious challenge, extremely serious one. It's like, it's a huge gap because it's of no use having all these good instruments if you're not going to be able to fund them and to enforce, to ensure that they are really bringing about what you need them, you design them for. And number two, what is it that we can do to have consequences or for the one who exported and the one who received illegally or scrupulously on behalf of his or her country? For example, if in South Africa the Minister of Environment, and I get bribed and I receive waste that I know that as a country we can't manage, but because the big brother country is contributing to our health budget, I can't say no to them. And you know how some of these countries, they would tell you, if you don't take this, we won't fund you. So then the country is caught between having this big brother country that is wanting to dump in it and having to decide between taking this hazardous waste and funding for basic things like sanitation or healthcare. So it's a serious thing that puts people, not just because they are prone, but the way in which I've seen that even in Montreal, where a country was forced to accept the amendment because a country wanted to create a legacy for their president. And we had no alternatives at that time. So these are practical, as long as we don't have practical, enforceable and accountable beyond the country that is affected internationally, the country that does that. And there's a question by a lady from, number one, I think it's Hannah Woodridge. She's speaking to something like that on the chat, whereby she's saying they are aware in England that this is happening, but there's no competent authority that is working with them. It speaks to what I'm saying, because on the Basel website, you'll have the name. But if Zuki is bought already, Zuki won't respond to Hannah from UK wanting to know or wanting the evidence. The same question that is cast about critical evidence, can these Asian countries bring that forth? It's tough. So there has to be something that we need to do to find, as in serious way, the perpetrator and the one that is receiving in the aggrieved country.
Yeah. Thank you, Suki. It's a horrific problem you're describing. It's deep corruption. It does take place. It's always better if the legislative and enforcement burden is on the exporter. It's always too late once it arrives in countries. So if you have the laws in place, like the ban amendment in the exporting states, and we would want to compliment the European Union because they have all ratified the ban amendment a long time ago and put it into their law. And therefore, enforcement is so much easier from the exporting side and corruption can be minimized. in that way. That's one answer. The other answer is, as a government official, you need to think about whistleblowing, passing the information to the fourth estate, to the media, to NGOs. This is the type of thing that has to happen when you have a deep corruption of what you described. So I hope that helps, and certainly we can talk offline. Is there any other questions about additives, cured resins, fluorinated, illegal traffic in plastics? If not, we've gone over time here, and the Secretary has been very kind to not boot us off. I will look for a hand raised if I don't see it in the next few minutes. I think we should call it a wrap. I think it's been an excellent webinar. We had over 180 participants, and we get the ball started, get the ball rolling on this second issue, which is extremely important. Just as the first set of amendments, we're going to need some new amendments to deal with the toxicity issues found hidden in plastics. So I thank you very much, and have a great day or night ahead of you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.